Hello, everybody. Okay, so I know we're not a huge crowd, but we have the speaker here. Well, we have a nice crowd, but we're outside. We have a speaker here so that we can try to blunt the noise from the fancy European bathroom over there, and this kind of knocks that out when you occasionally hear that. But it's lovely to be here on this beautiful day with fantastic weather here at East End Books, Ptown, and you can see behind me the fairly new public park, which opened several months ago. One of the few public access areas, and it's great because it's not only access to be out here on the swings to eat or whatever, but there's access to the beach there, and there's also handicap access. There's a ramp, so that's very important as well. And you can see when you're coming off the street that the town did a wonderful design so that you could actually get down with a wheelchair, because some places, it's rocks or little pebbles, that can be challenging. And so I think they did a fantastic job with this beautiful park. Elena, who's sadly passed on, owned that. It was a parking lot, and she owned all this, and she significantly reduced. Come on down. Yeah, significantly reduced the price of the town was able to buy it. So it was a phenomenal thing, a gift that she gave. So if you haven't been out there, take a look out there. So tonight, this will be like all the events. If you're watching at any point the live stream, about 10 minutes or so before it ends, if you want a signed copy that's to you, like Sam, Jeff, Sally, then buy the book on the website and put that in the memo section. I'll be looking while David is signing books to see if anybody has done that. If you don't need it to be to you individually, we will have signed copies here available, and you can just buy it and I'll ship those out. We'll have signed copies here for people in the store, and then since David is nearby, for how long? You're here for a month. What I'll do is, when we inevitably run out, is I'll give him a call to ask before he leaves to come and sign a whole bunch of books as well, so we'll have those. What we do with John Waters, he comes all the time to sign them. I'm going to ask David to do that as well. I told him earlier when he arrived, I had a few moments of panic because the book is sold out multiple times, and so finally I had to have the books shipped to my condo to make sure my employees would not mistakenly sell them, because the most embarrassing thing is if you're here with the author and there are no books, even if you sold them all. So we got them in, so we have the books for you. You probably saw some of you might have seen the piece in probably saw Independent about the book. It's just brilliant. I mean, I got an early advance review copy and was very excited, and then was thrilled to be able to put together an event here with these amazing 4 people that were chosen by David, who I think is one of the best writers in this country. And I have had a New Yorker subscription forever, and whenever everything he writes I read. I still think about great books. There's just so much. Yeah, I mean, it's just a thrill for you to be here today. So let me say to you that all of the events, of which there are many this summer, are on our website, and you can take a look at those events. Let me remind people that there is a nominal $5 charge, which helps us underwrite the cost of these events, but you don't even have to pay that if you can't afford to do it or don't want to. There's always an option on Eventbrite that says free ticket. I need a free ticket. So don't worry about that if that's what you need to do it, because what I want is for you to be able to see the authors and them to see you, so I don't care about the $5. I mean, the ABA says I shouldn't say that, but I mean, if you can afford it, do it, but we want you to come. Okay, what are the next couple of events that are happening? Tomorrow at 6 right out here, we have Judith Newcomb Stiles coming from Wellfleet, phenomenal artist who has a gallery there, whose first book got picked up by Penguin Random House, the biggest publisher in the world, Hush Little Fire. It's a fantastic book set in Wellfleet. I asked her, it's fiction, but I said, will people recognize themselves in Wellfleet, some people? And she said, well, I might be run out of town. But if you haven't read it yet, it's phenomenal. You can't put it down. It's a really great novel. And then on Monday, before we take a couple of days break, we have this book is a viral hit. I think it's not on the New York Times list. It's going to be soon. It's Blair Fell with Disco Witches of Fire Island. and we're expecting a very big crowd. I mean, this is one of the events where people RSVP and we get some idea of getting extra chairs because I have some idea from the advance. It's really a great book. It's being made to a movie. I think A24 acquired it, but Blair will tell us when he comes. So then the next event it's not here. It's the 16th. It's the 4th year in a row. We're thrilled to have the Hebridean Baker from Scotland, Cognac MacLeod, at the Provincetown Art Society, Ken Folk's nonprofit at the former home of Mary Heaton Vorse up the street. So he's got a new book out. There'll be a book talk. There'll be singing like there is, contests, fantastic food and libations. And then there's a new documentary out, a short documentary about, I can never say cognac. I like cognac, so I say cognac. Which will be, the premiere will be at the Provincetown Art Society. So the tickets for that are directly on the Provincetown Art Society website, and we'll be there selling books. If you cannot come to that event, and you can buy the book in the store here or on our website, and we'll get it signed for you at the event. So that's coming up. Everything else you'll see on there. Final thing I'll mention to you is save the date, August 15th at the Commons. I'm happy to co-chair an event with Neil Jacobs to benefit the Theater Offensive out of Boston. There'll be light bites, beer, wine, and food by Bespoke Soirees in New England. And there will be performances by Neon Calypso, Amanda Shea, and Letta Neely coming in. And this is an amazing group. I'm sharing their capital campaign. We're building a new theater in the Fenway. And this is a theater that's welcome to everyone. They've been around a long time, so they perform all across Boston. But the emphasis is on giving space for playwrights who are black and brown, queer and trans playwrights. And it's a remarkable thing. The former Mayor Marty Walsh in Boston did an incredible thing. He put together private and public money so that that space, you know, a lot of times people say if they want to donate money, what if they can't make it and they're shut down in a year or two because the rent is so high in Boston and keeps going up and you're paying triple net? And what about, you know, the lease is not renewed in 5 years? Well, the Theater Offensive has a 99-year lease, and the monthly rent is capped at $100. So they're going to survive and succeed, so it's wonderful. So if you get a chance to come to Provincetown for that, you can. If you're in Boston, on December 7th, I'm co-chairing another event for the Theater Offensive with Christy Cashman, the actress and actor, and her husband Jay Cashman, and some others, Ken Polk and others. It's going to be at the Quinn, which used to be the private club that used to be the Algonquin that Ken Polk is the creative director of. And it's going to be at the newest restaurant that Ken has designed called Lunasol, which is really like being in Sao Paulo. It's really wonderful. It's going to be a casual event with performances, music, auctions, things like that. So if you're around, the information about that one isn't out yet, but if you follow our social media, you'll see it soon. Okay, so David Denby, New York Times best-selling author of great books. How many people read that? It's one of my. I still go back to great books. It's fantastic. If you haven't, and we're sold out, but we're getting it back in. So if you haven't seen it, you want to see it. It's phenomenal. It's a classic. Other books include American Sucker and Lit Up. He was a film critic for New York Magazine and The New Yorker, where he's now a staff writer. His essays have appeared in the New Republic and The Atlantic. He lives in New York City with his wife, the novelist Susan Rieger, who's right here. And hopefully we'll get an event with Susan in the future, which would be nice here or in Boston in our store. So this book, Leonard Bernstein, Mel Brooks, Betty Friedan, Norman Mailer, brilliant, brash, yet soulful. They were 100% Jewish and 100% American. They upended the restrained culture of their forebears and changed American life. They worked in different fields, and apart from clinking glasses at parties now and then, they hardly knew one another, but they shared a historical moment and a common temperament. For all four, their Jewish heritage was electrified by American liberty. The results were explosive. As prosperity for Jews increased and anti-Semitism began to fade away after World War II, these four creative giants stormed through the latter half of the 20th century, altering the way people around the world listened to music, defined what was vulgar, comprehended the relations of men and women, and understood the American soul. They were not saints. They were turbulent and self-dissatisfied intellectuals who fearlessly wielded their own newly won freedom to charge up American culture. Phenomenal book by one of the best writers in this country today, David Denby.
I could open on Broadway with that. Barnes & Noble has classified this book with the four individuals that you just heard about in the category of religion. And no amount of protest has been able to shake that bizarre classification. This is a very worldly book, as I'm sure you understood from what you just heard. Anyway, individual stores can put the book wherever they want in Barnes & Noble, but it's the independent stores that really have done great work for me, and it's a privilege to speak here in this glorious setting. I think, well, maybe Mel and Norman would have enjoyed the notion of the toilet being flushed, because they were both obsessed with the body, and the Jewish body, I would say, and Lenny was too in his way, notoriously. But those two in the body in its, not just its glories, but in its production of effluvia, is that the right word? And many other substances. So my introduction to Provincetown was in 1998 when I interviewed a certain literary gentleman in the Red Brick House down the road, and he couldn't have been nicer. And his brawling days were over. And I want to come back to Norman and even read some stuff about him, because he's badly in need of rehabilitation at this point. Women, particularly young women, shudder at the sound of his name and wouldn't consider reading anything by him. And he is a great American writer. You have to go through his 44 books and cull very carefully what the good stuff is. But as a way into this, let me just tell you a couple of quick stories. Mel Brooks was walking across 57th Street, that way, near Carnegie Hall, early 50s. He was a sketch writer on your show of shows, the great Sid Caesar, pioneering television show, live, 90 minutes every Saturday night, which sort of created satire in television. There's a big book coming out about Sid Caesar by David Margolick in November, very good writer. Anyway, Mel is walking across 57th Street. He's like 24 years old. On his left is Larry Gelbart, who later, another sketch writer, later became wrote most of Tootsie, and created MASH for television. And on his right was Neil Simon, all unknown young guys. And three nuns were coming towards them. Some of you laughing already. And Gelbart said, "No, Mel, no." What? Nothing. What are you talking about? And Neil Simon said, "Will you get hold of yourself?" He said, "Nothing. I don't understand." The nuns come closer and closer, and Mel leaps out at them and says, "Take off those costumes. The nun sketch is out." How did they respond? He told me this. I mean, he's told it before, but he told it to me. He said they hit the ground. Anecdote number 2, a little more serious. Leonard Bernstein is rehearsing the great Vienna Philharmonic in the Musikvereinssaal in Vienna in 1972 in Mahler's Fifth Symphony. And you can watch this. It's easy to find on YouTube. It was filmed. And they get to the enormous climax near the end of the first movement, anguish climax. And they're holding back. And he loses his temper, which was something very rare for Lenny with an orchestra. The necessary backstory. All right already. Mahler had been conductor of the Vienna State Opera and the Vienna Philharmonic from 1897 to 1907, and they had played some of his symphonies under his conductorship. This was his music, their music rather. This was their music, and they didn't know it. They knew a couple of the early symphonies, but not the great, tangled, extraordinarily challenging and beautiful 5, 6, 7, and 9. And he lost his temper, and said, "I know you know the notes, but it's Mahler that's missing." And he threatened to walk out, in effect. And later he reported hearing from the ranks, Scheiß Musik, crap music. Crap music was Jewish music. Anecdote number 3, Betty Friedan brings out The Feminine Mystique in 1963. It came out, unfortunately, during a newspaper strike, but it sold well. It sold 60,000 copies. And she and her husband kept bothering the publisher, a guy named Brockway at Norton Books, then as now a publisher of serious nonfiction. You'll probably find some in the store, anthologies, and so on and so forth. And the book went into paperback, an Adele mass market paperback. You remember when we were kids, and or even 30 years ago, in every drugstore and every supermarket, there were those circular metal racks at the front of the store that would have, a couple of Shakespeare plays and, I don't know, Pearl Buck, and it also had Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique. So it sold over 1 million copies. So Brockway took her to lunch and rubbed his hands together and said, "Let's talk about our next book together." And she said, "What next book, George? You're not going to get my next book. You made me feel so Jewish when I was trying to sell my book. Fuck you." So, what is my point? The point is not that Jews should tell off Gentiles, or that that's some sort of virtue, or not at all, of course. What I'm getting at is that they did not expect to be punished. They did not expect to be punished. Now, if you think about the Jews in the diaspora in Spain and England and France and Germany, they lived there on sufferance. That is, you can stay, you can practice your religion sometimes. In some cases, in 19th century Budapest and Vienna and Berlin, you could enter the professions after making certain concessions and so on. But it was always on sufferance, we will allow you. And in America and in Israel, they do not live on sufferance anymore. They feel at home. And so that was what intrigued me, this kind of confidence. So I thought, okay, let's take 4 individuals who particularly gained from the development of new media after the war. Long playing record, I mentioned the paperback books, television changed all our lives. Those two were, 1948 became the turning point, and so on. So I said, okay, those who were born after the First World War and matured after the Second World War. So that ruled out Bellow, who was older, and Philip Roth, who was younger, and a lot's been written about them in any case. So I came up with these 4 who, as you heard, didn't know each other. I mean, Betty and Norman had some arguments. And by the way, just parenthetically, Norman Mailer, who is known as a misogynist, had no problems with mainstream feminism. He totally approved of the National Organization of Women, Betty's, big organization, their plans, equal pay for equal work. He even came around on abortion, and so on. It was the radical feminists who emerged around 1970. He wrote a book called The Prisoner of Sex. It was in the heroic age of magazine journalism. It was all in Harper's Magazine. And it was a response to Kate Millett's Sexual Politics, which was a big deal. In 1970, she was on the cover of Time magazine and so on. The family is the prison house of Western culture, and children should be raised in groups anonymously. And as much as possible, the penis should be expelled from women's sexual pleasure. That was what he was not about to expel the penis by any means. And he wrote this piece, this extraordinary essay, which then gave rise to an event at Town Hall, which you can watch, it was filmed by Don Pennybaker and Hegedus, Town Bloody Hall. And it was Norman and Diana Trilling and Germaine Greer, of whom he did approve, who was lusty and funny and so on, certainly not anti-male. Anyway, and he took on the radical feminists in what became a very noisy event. So my point about Mailer is that what he loathed was the introduction of technology into reproduction, and he was stupid on this issue, since he glorified sex as something that was a transcendent experience. It was either transcendent or it was nothing. It had to come up from the earth, from God. And you know, in that 50s mania for the mutual orgasm, which probably caused, you know, more, I don't know, sacroiliac and arthritic pain than any habit one can imagine. That was what he was upset about. And of the 6 wives, by the way, they were not bimbos. They were really interesting women, and including Norris Church, the last, who was a painter and writer, as well as a great beauty. Anyway, I got off the track, but why these 4 again? After the war, it was obvious, although you weren't supposed to say so in public, that the American Jewish community was doing well financially. Ira Katznelson, who used to be provost at Columbia, told me that until the late 90s, there was no scholarly study of Jewish financial success. There was one guy, Simon Kuznets, who a Nobel winner in the 50s, who wrote about it, but it was other sociologists, not Jews, who wrote about it. The feeling was, let's not poke the bear. Let's not cause resentment. Let's not cause anti-Semitism. Let's stay away from anything that approaches a boast. But everyone knew it, and it was not success in big industries like oil or steel or automobiles or chemicals or railways, but it was success in all the professions, medicine and lawyering, particularly in the teaching of all sorts, and entertainment, of course, both Broadway, the movies, and then the early broadcasting were generally Jewish dominated, invented, and so on. There was that. There was, after so much anti-Semitism in the 30s and 40s, there was a kind of philo-Semitism in the 50s and 60s. A lot of Yiddish jokes on television. There was the procession of the Catskill comics to our weekly entertainment review, the Ed Sullivan Show, right, Sunday night. There was a period, Wallace Markfeld, the novelist, said you couldn't turn on TV without hearing some sort of joking way of using Yiddish somehow or other. So it was a whole bunch of things. The New York intellectuals, which I've just written about in the London Review of Books in the current issue. An extraordinary group of largely Jewish, not entirely, but largely Jewish, self-made men and women, outer borough boys, who created the Partisan Review, a great magazine, and had an enormous effect on American literary culture. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why that period seemed to me the right one to study biographically, and the fact that they weren't doing the same thing, so you couldn't easily compare and contrast made it more challenging to me. And my question was for myself was how would Jews behave for good and for ill if they enjoyed the kind of liberty they had never had before anywhere? I think I haven't checked it with historians of Jewish culture, but I think I will stand by that statement. So in this book, there's a lot of extraordinary effort and a lot of extraordinary demand on oneself and on others, and there's also plenty of bad behavior. I don't leave it out. I try to analyze it, and particularly. Well, let's come back to Norman because it's an anxious and vexed subject. As you probably know, apart from the occasional head-butting and brawling, he assaulted his second wife, Adele Morales, with a penknife, and it's very lucky for her and very lucky for him that he didn't kill her. This was in 1960. And so I want to try to understand that. I spent quite a lot, I don't want to duck away from it, I spent quite a lot of time on it because he had a heroic conception of himself, which involved obeying whatever impulses he felt from the deep. His attitude was, if you something that was just a passing thought, or a desire that became conscious, that it had to be authentic, and therefore it was shameful not to act on it. Instead of getting on the couch, which was very much the 50s thing to do, and to go back to childhood traumas, which would explain neurotic behavior in the present psychoanalysis, he said, no, what you do is act it out. That's the way you cleanse yourself. That's the way you cure yourself. That's the way you're capable of love, if you're capable of doing this. And of course, this is a very dangerous idea, and caused himself, as well as others, a fair amount of pain. The axes of his behavior were courage and shame. And in that regard, not all that different, despite the enormous passage of centuries from the kind of warrior code of the Iliad. You either made the utmost effort to do whatever it was you were doing, get to the outer edge of that effort, or you faced diminution of yourself. In other words, it was very consciously, and this is true for all of them, but particularly for Norman, it was conscious, an attempt to get away from what they all took to be the dreary side of the 50s, the conformity, the consumerism that inhibited freedom in so many ways. And Betty, of course, was in the Feminine Mystique was particularly a critic of consumerism because women were being trapped by it. And the Feminine Mystique, which, by the way, is still very much worth reading. I didn't read it, certainly didn't read it when it came out. I read it 20 years later, and then I read it again a few years ago when I was working on this. It's still interesting, it's still challenging, like all obsessional books. It's repetitive, it's garrulous. But as she was appalled by the fact that so many women were not going to college, who were obviously qualified, or were dropping out, and were not taking on challenging courses and not doing challenging work. So she set about talking to suburban women and using the methods of magazine reporting, which was something she was very, very good at. She started with working for trade union publications, and then later wrote for the women's magazines, which had McCall's and Red Book and so on, had an extraordinary circulation that's just unimaginable today, like 7 million copies a month, and all sorts of good people wrote for them. Anyway, that the Feminine Mystique grew out of that, and so she interviewed women all over the East Coast using just the methods of magazine journalism. She didn't have access to big data. She wasn't trained in sociology. It was an extraordinary pioneering effort. And the critique of the book from the first day has been that it was limited by her sample, that these were white, middle, and upper middle class women in the suburbs. And my retort to that is absolutely true, and the extraordinary amount of work since then by academics and journalists on working class women, on Black and Latino women, and so on, it was absolutely necessary to fill in the picture. But what Betty was reading and talking to were so-called experts who had general ideas about women's nature. And they were just talking about the essence of women, the same thing that Simone de Beauvoir was fighting against years earlier. So even though her data sample was limited by class, by race, and so on, she got at an extraordinary layer of unexamined prejudicial thought that appeared everywhere in the 50s, in literature, in movies, in advertising, in psychoanalysis, and so on. So that was her way of breaking out of the 50s stranglehold. Lenny was, of course, extraordinarily gifted, and I have a lot of fun comparing him with Herbert von Karajan, the two most famous conductors of the late 20th century. Von Karajan grew up in Salzburg, Mozart's home, was publicly performing when he was 6, and so on. Lenny grew up in the Boston suburbs, and von Karajan and his family would go to beautiful mountain retreats in the summer, and Lenny would go to teach at summer camps and put on shows. He did a drag version of Carmen, in which he played Carmen. Anyway, from the time he was 14, I would say, or 15, he realized, he didn't put it in words like this, but this is that whatever thought he had, he could express physically. There was no distinction between mind and body for him. There was no distinction between intellectual formulations and physical acting out. As a musician, this is a sexual awakening, but it's also an intellectual awakening, and that is what made him so disturbing to so many people. The full body conducting style, which, if you've ever seen him, is a bit of a shock the first time, because it's not, restrained and refined. Von Karajan basically he's very powerful to watch, but he beat time with his right hand and shaped the music with his left hand, which becomes a kind of claw. It's a little frightening, actually. Lenny was in communication with every member of the orchestra, and he subdivided the beat, and he looked at people, he smiled. It was total involvement. But this really annoyed people in New York and in the music world. Everyone knew he was extraordinarily gifted. He took over the Philharmonic for a concert without rehearsal, the episode that's in Brad Cooper's movie, Maestro. No rehearsal. You can hear it. It's a CD. It conducted, very difficult program, extremely well. And then he became conductor of the Philharmonic in 1958, after writing the 4 shows that were so wonderful: On the Town, Wonderful Town, West Side Story, and Candide, and then West Side Story. Candide, if you've never heard it or seen it, is a monster. It's an operetta, and it's an homage to European music styles. And it's all over the place, and it's just completely wonderful. And his last recording of it, which pulled together all the different versions of it, is something really to hear. Anyway, his way of conducting and his multiple activities upset a lot of people. And he took over the Philharmonic in '58, and initially there was tremendous excitement because there had never been an American conductor or a music director of a great American orchestra. They're all Europeans, mainly Hungarian Jews: Zell, Reiner, Ormandy, Dorati, Schulte, so on. an American at last. And then the anger and the contempt started, and there was a period where he couldn't get a good review in New York. And part of it, I'm convinced, was that freely expressive body movement in front of an orchestra. They thought it was hammy. They thought it was show business. It was unnecessary. What he did was produce a kind of parallel narrative to the music itself. In other words, if you were watching him on television, or if you were watching him just in the orchestra, you could get into the piece as well as from the music itself, but by the way he conducted it, by what he expressed of it he dramatized the meaning of the pieces, and particularly Mahler, which was new for a lot of people, and I myself had an overwhelming experience, never having heard the Third Symphony before at a concert of his in Carnegie Hall in 1961, and the last movement of the Mahler Third, if you know it, is following Tchaikovsky's Pathétique, which also ends with a slow movement. It is a 25-minute adagio at the end of a 90-minute symphony, and it is overwhelming. And it had an incredible effect on me. I didn't know you could feel those kind of things outside of, I don't know, dreams or nightmares. Anyway, the attack on him was relentless, and particularly in the New York Times. Harold Schoenberg, let's put it this way, my four subjects were Russian Jews. The German Jews disapproved of Leonard Bernstein. It was not proper. And then the fact that he was doing 5 or 6 things with his life. You know, most of us are good at one thing or 2 things. I can write a little bit. I can make a 3-egg omelet. That's it. He could do 6 things extremely well. So the attack was always, why don't you just stick to writing shows? Or why don't you just stick to conducting orchestras? Or why don't you just stick to creating classical pieces? And in that period from 1943 to 1958, he wrote a couple of good symphonies and the Serenade, which has become fixed as a virtuoso violin piece, and so on. And my feeling about it, and even Stephen Sondheim, who was a close friend of his after Lenny died, said, oh, he was never good at anything, really great at anything, because he didn't concentrate on one thing alone. That's just terrible. First of all, he would, by the 80s certainly, he was universally considered one of the great conductors in the world, everywhere. And second, he was one of the great teachers in the world. I mean, just to hear him talking about music, explaining, and I want to come back to that because there's a didactic element in all 4 of these things, which I associate with a kind of Jewish tradition of study and teaching. But when you think, okay, Susan said to me, yeah, okay, they want him to have given up. One of his things that he was great at. What exactly would you want to have given up? West Side Story? The Serenade for violin, which I just mentioned. The Young People's Concerts, which are, by the way, still utterly worth watching. The Norton lectures on music. I mean, all these things are terrific. And so my feeling is, against what Sondheim and others, and Harold Schoenberg and all these people said, was that he had to do all of his things to be at his best in any one of them. And that's a statement you couldn't make about almost anyone else you can think of, and he suffered a lot from it, and that's in Brad Cooper's movie also. The fact that he always felt he was letting somebody down, because whatever he did that you liked, you wanted more of that thing from him, and he felt even that he was self-betraying, because he never thought he was as great a classical composer as he could have been. I argue, I'm not so sure of that. I think his problems were musical, that there were certain limits to what he could do. But and I'm not I'm not knocking what he did do, but it has limits. Anyway, and continuing with this notion of liberating the Jewish body, because their previous generation, Philip Roth said, the Jews were successful in the United States because for 40 years they went to bed sober. Talk about generalizations. But there's a particle of truth there. I mean, my parents, who were very gentle people, despised what they called shickers, meaning men who drank. Why? Because they were not responsible for their families. It was a disgrace. There was a sexual reticence in the generation of Mailer's parents and so on, which certainly these four were, consciously or not, were determined to overturn. Betty Friedan, it's very paradoxical, and I spent a lot of time trying to unwind it. The most famous feminist in the country was in a dreadful marriage, in many ways. It was sexually very alive, certainly in the beginning, and she, in her autobiography, which she wrote in her late 70s, talked very explicitly about how much pleasure she had with her husband. But she got herself into trouble, and it was one of the many reasons that she lost control of herself and the movement, because she loathed gay women and lesbianism and thought it was some sort of FBI threat to the movement itself, and constantly tried to keep gay women out. This is into the late 60s, which of course was just insane because for many reasons, but just sheer prejudicial nonsense, but also politically insane, since gay women were and are a large part of the feminist movement. She finally came around, but she also was determined to get every ounce of sensual pleasure she could out of life, and she hated the austerity of the radical feminists just as much as Mailer did. Mel, as I said, comes out of, I guess you could say, long traditions of burlesque, and whatever preceded it, Rough House and travesty, going back to the Middle Ages, or maybe even back to, Greece and Rome, and burlesque depends on on the expression of the body as a disgrace, and so that was constantly an area of fun for him. I take him a little more seriously than most people do. I hope without destroying the fun. And I'm very struck by two. Throughout his life, his humor, if you actually listen to a lot of it, is rather dark. He gives great joy. And personally, he's just ebullient and full of energy. I haven't talked to him in a couple of years, but when the last time I talked to him, he was a mere 97, and he's fast, and he's very precise. And I said, "How are you always so precise?" He said, "When you're 16 and you're in the Catskills, I say, kid, you got 3 minutes. That's it. You got 3 minutes." He said, "You learn how to tell a joke and very carefully." His humor is dark, a lot of it, and it's a constant grappling with death and expelling death by making a joke out of it. And so Cole Reiner, is the 2,000-year-old man, in one of their conversations, said to him, "What's the difference between comedy and tragedy?" He said, "Tragedy is when I cut my finger on a piece of paper. Comedy is when you fall into a ditch and die." So I said to him, "Mel, you stole that from David Hume, the philosopher." David Hume said, it's not contrary to reason to prefer the death of the entire universe to the cutting of your finger by a piece of paper. He said, I don't know about that. His obsession with Hitler. He carried a black comb in his, maybe still does, in his back pocket, and whips it out, you know, and does German double talk, gibberish talk. And now look at the two most outrageous things he did in movies from the producer, Springtime for Hitler, right? Musical number. He wrote the music, he wrote the song, the lyrics. Swishy SS guy coming down the stairs, women with pretzels and beer mugs in their heads and pasties, and so on. Ridicule Nazism by embedding it in the most cliched routines of Broadway musicals. The big production number. Okay, that's a lot of fun. A lot of people were very offended. This was 1967. The Holocaust was much in conversation in that period, and not that long ago from the actual events. Even Pauline Kael, who reviewed for the New Yorker and said everything she wanted to say about a movie, never mentioned that number, which just astounds me. I'm sorry, I never asked her why. Okay, but everyone loves that thing. Now jump forward to History of the World Part 1. Some of you are nodding. History of the World Part 1 is, how would you describe it, a series of sketches about atrocious behavior throughout history. Mel, as wearing Charlton Heston's red cloak, emerges from Mount Sinai holding 3 tablets at the beginning. Hear, O Israel, he says, or something. Yeah. The Lord has given you these 15, one tablet drops, these 10 command. Right, okay, and you remember the end probably, that he's at Versailles and he's peering down everyone's décolletage, and I just keep saying, it's good to be the king. But there, in this bawdy show, History of the World Part 1, there is something that's very disturbing. Genuinely disturbing, and it is the number called the Inquisition. And the Spanish Inquisition, and it's another musical number like Springtime for Hitler, and Mel is Torquemada in a red cassock, and there's a bunch of nuns who dance with him and sing with him, Inquisition, like that. And Jews are strung up on the wall with all the varieties of Spanish cruelty, plus a few things that Mel invented himself, like the Jews in a slot machine and getting turned and the heads coming out together, and then nuns again coming out of the walls and taking their black costumes off. Oh, that goes back to his joke on 57th Street. And underneath they're wearing white bathing suits like an Esther Williams movie, and they pull the Jews who are all in black cloaks and hats and payasses and so on underwater. I mean, it's an extraordinary image of Jewish humiliation. So I lean on these things. What in the world was he doing? And I said to him about Springtime for Hitler, were you saying to the audience, particularly the Jews in the audience, Hitler is dead, the Nazis are dead, you're alive, you're doing okay in America, get over it. And he said, oh no, I'm just an entertainer, a very good entertainer, mind you. There's a tradition among American popular artists of not making big claims for yourself. John Ford would show up at meetings, great director in Hollywood, and say, I'm John Ford, I make Westerns. That's it. The worst thing you can do is make some pretentious statement. And Mel is in that tradition. I'm just an entertainer. But he said, maybe you're right. So a year later, I came back to him with the Inquisition. And I said, that's really a kick in the solar plexus to Jews. I mean, to see them be a musical number, a mockery being made out of this moment of extreme humiliation. Weren't you really trying to say, get over it? You're alive. We can't stop anyone from murdering the Jews, but we can stop murdering ourselves. And at that point, he did cop to it. And he said, yes, there is that. Now, I don't want to put words in his mouth, because after October 7th, he might not, say anything like that at all. And then the little kicker here, which he didn't know, but it absolutely happened. When the producers opened in Berlin, this was the show, the musical version that Susan Stroman did the choreographer and director and choreographer. On opening night, the ushers placed into the Berlin theatergoer's hand a little Nazi flag. Pow! And he said he didn't know about it, but none less than Michael Kimmelman, the Times' great culture reporter, wrote about it at length in the Times. It happened. So, I mean, he likes to provoke, and he likes to push the Jews a little harder than they want to be. And it goes back to the Catskills and his whole way of dealing with the audience. It's complicated business, where sometimes he would tell jokes that had no point, just as a rebellion against the kind of easy humor. Anyway, I've been going on for quite a while, and maybe now I should stop. What I'm trying to get at is how people express liberty when they feel comfortable, and for good or for ill. And I will, if anyone's interested, I will talk about Mailer and his poor second wife, Adele Morales, who, by the way, lived until the age of 90 and wrote a book about what happened. And I think they had a liberating effect, certainly on Jews, maybe not on the entire culture. I mean, something was certainly happening in the late 60s, because you have at the same time Mailer's Armies of the Night, which is his great book about a march on the Pentagon during the heights of the Vietnam War, which begins with him getting drunk in a theater where earnest young people have assembled to face the Pentagon the next day. And he establishes his authenticity by telling you terrible things about himself. You have Portnoy's Complaint, which began as something that Philip Roth was doing as a dinner table entertainment for his friends, and gradually evolved into Portnoy's Complaint. And you have the producers, which outraged so many people. There was a kind of breaking free of Jewish restraint in the late 60s, and was part of a cultural moment. And certainly all these three have had many successors, conductors following Bernstein, comedians following Mel. Among writers, I think there's two of his fans are Joan Didion, one of the women who loved Mailer and wrote about him frequently, and Don DeLillo, very great fiction writer. So, I mean, maybe that's a good place to stop if there are questions or comments or whatever.
A question back there, looks like.
Go ahead, I yield to you.
Yeah, I don't know if he fits into your time scheme, but where does Woody Allen fit in this?
Well, I'm playing with the idea of writing a book about the Salon des Réfugiés, and James Levine, the great conductor of the Metropolitan Opera, Woody Allen. We don't have that much art in this country that we can, casually just dispose of people who behave badly. And this is a man who made Annie Hall, Manhattan, Vicky Cristina, Barcelona, 3 or 4 others, really great movies, and wrote a lot of comedy. I think he needs some rehabbing as well as Mailer. This is a vexed problem. I think you know where I'm going. I mean, Dickens left his wife, who I think had bore him 11 children, set up his mistress in a country house, and denounced his wife in the London papers. Shakespeare, of course, left his wife and children behind in Stratford and spent, 30 years in London? I mean, he did go home and visit, but I imagine he had a very interesting time in London, romantically. Tolstoy left Sonia, who had copied War and Peace 3 times, if not more, and also I think they had 11 or 12 children at the very end of his life, and you could go on and on. My feeling is, if you want to say that the bad behavior affected the work and corrupted the work, then you've got real grounds for dismissal. And the case that people mention is Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was a great modernist poet, now contemporary of Eliot and so on, and was a fascist propagandist during World War II, made broadcasts for the Italian networks aimed at Americans, and they were full of anti-Semitic rant. And so a very good literary critic, Irving Howe, in 1948 said, look, I can show you how his anti-Semitism ruined this stanza and that stanza of his enormous poem, The Cantos. Okay, that seems to me serious work. But if you're saying it's just bad behavior and it hasn't killed their artistic integrity, then I think holding artists to that kind of strict account is not a good idea. I mean, there's not going to be many people left. And we could all name our favorites probably. But certainly Woody requires some rehabilitation. I mean, there's so many of them. I haven't even kept up with them. I mean, there've been like 5 movies in the last, right? I mean, and he's in his late 80s. Yeah, sir.
I want to see James Levine rehabilitated. There used to be a photograph in Symphony Hall in Boston of James Levine, about 8 years old, sitting in a big easy chair reading a script. You can't see that picture. He's been erased entirely.
I think his recordings are still available.
They are.
And he was not only a great opera conductor who held the Metropolitan Opera together for 30 years, he was a great symphony conductor also, and he made recordings of Mahler and Brahms with the Chicago Symphony and the Berlin Philharmonic that are ranked with the best.
But actually,
And yeah, go ahead.
I actually had a question aside from him. I noticed when you went through, some of the notable compositions of Bernstein, you didn't mention Kaddish.
The Third Symphony. Yeah, the Kaddish Symphony is a problematic case. I did do a piece on it once, and the Kaddish Symphony is a full-fledged symphony with a narrator. And the narrator assails God for his indifference, assails him for not being present. Bernstein, I think like Kafka before him, was obsessed with the God that he wasn't quite sure existed, which is a strange but productive obsession. And I've talked to Bernstein's daughter Jamie about this, and various people, I think including her, have tried to rewrite the text, which is bumptious and crude. And there's a lot of good music in that symphony. A lot of very striking music. Sounds a little bit like Shostakovich at times. So, yeah, and then there's the Chichester Psalms, which he wrote for an Anglican cathedral, and used material from different psalms, and the bishop said to him, "We don't mind if this sounds like West Side Story." And so he put in passages that it doesn't have the Latino sound of West Side Story, but it certainly have that kind of, raucous excitability. I mean, and it captures the different moods of the Old Testament. I think that's perhaps his best classical piece. I mentioned the Serenade. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
This is based on something you said early on. So what would you say were Mailer's greatest books?
Oh, good. Well, there's The Naked and the Dead, which is probably still the best World War II novel. It is exhaustingly long. And what it's best at is the everydayness of warfare, not the battles, but just the hauling and sweating of being in the jungle. And it has a long virtuoso section where two guys carry a wounded comrade on a stretcher out of the jungle back towards the base. And he gets in that, as I sort of said at the beginning, the outer edge of male exhaustion, of some state between exhaustion and death. And I find that very moving and very elegant. So that one certainly, I could do without the Deer Park and Barbary Coast. And the great things are the journalistic books, The Armies of the Night, which I mentioned, all the convention reports, the Kennedy Convention. He just sort of slaughtered anyone who had written about political conventions. Miami and the Siege of Chicago, which is about what happened in 1968. First the Republicans in Miami, and then the cataclysmic convention, the Democratic Convention in Chicago. He wrote a book that no one has read about Lee Harvey Oswald. It's called Oswald's Tale. And what happened was his friend Lawrence Schiller, who got him into a lot of things, said that the Soviet Union collapsed and the KGB files were opening up, and he said, let's go and see what we can find out about Lee Harvey Oswald when he was here with Marina. And the first half of that book, it's enormously long, is a recreation of Lee and Marina's life in very depressing Russia in 1959, I think, when they were there, before they came back to the States, 59, 60. And it's terrific. And he keeps himself out of it. It's not one of these books where Mailer is the main character. It's written in rather chaste third-person style. But he couldn't stop writing, so he gets them back to the United States, and he kept on going. And he was trying to figure out, solve the riddle of the assassination. And he wound up essentially recreating in much better terms the Warren Commission report. So another 1,000-page book. But I'm skipping over the one that matters, and that, of course, is The Executioner's Song. And it was Schiller again, a guy who had a nose for story and was there at the OJ trial and some of that kind of. He's still alive, Lawrence Schiller. Gary Gilmore was a lifetime con who was finally released, and wound up with some family and friends and a girlfriend and so on in south central Utah. And he killed two people in a way that makes no sense whatsoever. Just killed them. Was turned in by his family, was tried, convicted, and he was set up for execution. And all of liberal America tried to, because there weren't any executions, right, in this period. And the ACLU and everyone else tried to have the thing, at least forestall this. And he said, no, I want to be executed, I want to be shot by a firing squad. I want to be killed by a firing squad. And Mailer wasn't following this particularly, but Schiller was there and was interviewing everybody. And after it happened, he called up Mailer and said, I've got all of this material. I interviewed Gary, I interviewed his girlfriend, and so on. isn't there a book here? And they signed a paperback deal to for a few $100,000 to produce the book together, a book of maybe 400 pages. And Mailer spent the next 8-9 months out there, sometimes with Schiller, sometimes alone, interviewing everybody. And this was the most notoriously flamboyant stylist in American letters, who had made himself a character in so many of his narratives. Mailer does this, Mailer does that, including Armies of the Night, where it works extremely well. And he took himself out of it altogether. And it's the enormous text is in the voices of those in South Central Utah. Gary, his girlfriend, his family, the officers of the court, the lawyers, everything, and it is mesmerizing. The Executioner's Song, and it won all the prizes. And I think even those who don't like Mailer consider it a masterpiece. It's something to take on, but it's very moving. And Joan Didion reviewed it in the New York Times, and she said only Mailer would have had the courage to face what the modern West is really like. Anyone else who really understood it wouldn't be able to write it down. He got it. The flatness, the bleakness, the lack of connection, the aimlessness. It just turned all the Western myths inside out, but without any ostentation at all. I think that's a great book. So
we can keep talking, but I need to stop the live stream before, so we can
okay.
keep
Right.
have questions, but and sign books and stuff.
My wife's giving me the hook.
Thank you, Dave.
Not the first time.
And we have books available. Thank you.